Welcome to Chapter 14.2, Turbulent Centuries in Africa. The Portuguese established footholds on the coast of West Africa, building small forts and trading posts. From West Africa, they sailed around the continent. They continued to establish forts and trading posts, but they also attacked coastal cities like in East Africa, such as Mombasa and Malindi, which were hubs of international trade. They also took over the Arab, thriving East African trade network. Slavery had existed in Africa since ancient times. The Europeans began to view slaves as the most important aspect of the African trade. And by the 1500s, European participation had encouraged so much broader Atlantic slave trade, and it grew into such a huge and profitable business that to fill the need for cheap labor that it almost depopulated Africa. They especially needed workers on their plantations in the Americas. Some African leaders tried to slow down or stop the transatlantic slave trade. The ruler of Congo, Afonso I, who had been tutored by Portuguese missionaries, wanted to maintain contact with the Europeans, but end the slave trade. And the slave trade, however, continued. The slave trade had major effects on African states. Because of the loss of countless numbers of young Africans, some small states actually disappeared forever. At the same time, new states arose, which with ways of life that depended on the slave trade. The Asante Kingdom emerged in the area occupied by present-day Ghana. In the late 1600s, an able military leader, Osei Tutu, won control for the trading city of Kumasi. From there he conquered the neighboring peoples and unified the Asante Kingdom. Under Osei Tutu, the Asante Kingdom held a monopoly over the gold mining and slave trade of that region. The Oyo Empire arose from successive waves of settlement by the Yoruba people in the region of present-day Nigeria. Its leaders used wealth gained from the slave trade to build a strong army. By the 1600s, several other European powers had established forts along the west coast of Africa. And in 1652, Dutch immigrants arrived at the southern tip of the continent. They built Cape Town, the first permanent European settlement in Africa, to supply ships sailing to or from the East Indies. Dutch farmers, called Boers, settled in the land surrounding that port. Around the time of Christ, Bantu speakers, which were a small group of people who lived around what is now modern-day Nigeria, on Africa's west coast, began to move southward, settling for a time in Central Africa, south of the equator. And because of much of Central Africa is a plateau, its topsoil is very thin, and the groundwater is kind of scarce. And these conditions promote a migrating lifestyle rather than settling and agriculture and that kind of thing. So the Bantus continued to move gradually south and east until they reached what is modern-day Zimbabwe. And so by the 8th century, the southeastern coast of Africa was basically populated by Bantu-speaking people. These people already had a knowledge of ironworking, and that gave them a great advantage over the peoples that were originally there, the Pygmy, or the Xhosa people, who lived in the drier regions of that area. The Scottish missionary and explorer David Livingstone, who explored Africa in between 1813 and 1873, wrote about a Bantu village in these terms. Food abounds, and very little labor is required for its cultivation. When a garden becomes too poor for good crops, the owner removes a little from farther into the forest, and he burns around the roots of the larger trees to kill them. And then he cuts down the smaller ones so that a new rich garden can be prepared for seed. Most of Africa was animistic in beliefs. Most people believed that a supreme being had created the universe, and that was the source of all the life, but individual men and women could not know or communicate with that being. And the being had put its spirit into all these living things, or it had animated them. And so all things had this spirit residing in them, like trees and water and things like that. And this is what we call animism. And in order to have good things happen to you, you need to placate the spirits that are in living and sometimes non-living things. And in order to have good harvests and to have healthy children and things like that. And so in order to placate these spirits, you need to follow exact ceremonies and exact rituals in order to not offend any of the spirits and to get their blessing. So this was what colored the societies in Africa. The period from about 800 to 1450, when the Europeans arrived, there were a lot of powerful African states that emerged in the Sudan and in the western part of Africa. And some of these large empires were Ghana and Mali, and they had huge royal bureaucracies. On the East Coast, there were also several city-states that were based on sophisticated trade networks, and these were highly influenced by Islam. Some of these, or Christianity as well. One of these was Ethiopia, which has claimed to be the oldest territory in Africa that has never been conquered by a European power. In South Africa, there was the Great Zimbabwe, which was built in present-day Zimbabwe, which the present-day Zimbabwe was named after. But the word Zimbabwe actually means stone structure, and so if you go to certain areas in South Africa, you will find these huge stone enclosures that apparently were built on the wealth that was developed from trade up and down that coast. And we don't know very much about this civilization because there have not been found any written records. Portugal was motivated by two main motivations. Well, actually three, if you want to count glory. But the two biggest ones were economic and religious. They wanted to find an all-water route to Asia in order to bypass the Italian and Muslim monopoly on the spice trade. And they also wanted to find the mythical leader or African king, which they had named Prester John. This was a medieval story that had spread throughout Europe, that somewhere in Africa there was a Christian king who had reigned for several hundred years and was somewhere in the east, and he had made alliances in order to protect himself against Muslim onslaught. And most historians think that that story may have had some basis on the actual kingdom of Ethiopia, which was technically a Christian kingdom, although in practice it was much more animistic than Christian. So those are the two main reasons why Portugal began its exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, as we talked about, had been the main leader in that endeavor. And as they moved down the West African coast, they began to set up trading posts along the way. And the things that they were trading with the Africans, or what the Africans wanted most, were guns in order to be able to protect themselves from their marauding neighbors. And they also wanted to have cloth that was being produced from Europe. And in return, they were willing to give gold and ivory and special agricultural things like cola nuts, which have a mild stimulant effect. But most importantly, they were willing to give trade slaves. And eventually the Portuguese they rounded the tip of South Africa, and they began to attack the Arab trading centers on the east side of Africa, specifically Malindi and Mombasa. The Portuguese also began to trade with present-day Zimbabwe and Zambia in the southeastern part of Africa. In the 1500s, though, the Europeans began to trade for slaves on a much, much larger scale. And it's a misconception to think that the Europeans were going into the African continent, capturing innocent and unsuspecting people, and dragging them to other parts of the world to work as slaves. It was actually the Africans themselves who were enslaving one another and selling them to Europeans who were willing participants in the slave trade. Over the 300 years that the slave trade went on, the thousands and thousands of Africans were sold to work on large plantations in North and South America, and also the Caribbean. So, some African leaders were so appalled by the amount of people that were being shipped over to these areas that they tried to stop the slave trade, but they were not successful. One notable leader was named Afonso I, who was a king of the Congo civilization. But the slave trade caused some of the African states to disappear completely. And one of the culprits was a king whose name was Osei Tutu, who used his acquisition of guns from Portuguese traders to solidify his position and to capture neighboring tribes and sell them as slaves. By conquering neighboring people and creating an efficient government bureaucracy, he actually gained a monopoly over the gold trade and the slave trade. This picture of a slaving ship just shows you the horrible conditions that the slaves experienced as they were being shipped over from Africa to North or South or Central America. They were jammed into ships that without any room to breathe or move or anything. They were just considered like cattle. And in fact, at least 1/3 of them were not expected to live through the passage. So it was a very, very horrendous experience. As Portugal's power began to decline and other European nations began to establish footholds in Africa, France and Britain began to colonize the west coast of Africa. And by the 1700s, British explorers were looking for the source of the Nile in East Africa. And by 1788, the British had established the African Association, which sponsored exploration. European exploration of Africa, it didn't really impact the interior of Africa until the late 1800s. So Africa, it was nicknamed the Dark Continent by many European countries because it was not a lot was really known by Europeans about the interior of Africa. In South Africa, the Dutch began to settle a Cape colony, and the Dutch farmers who came to settle there were known as Boers, Boers. They were Calvinists, strict Calvinists, and they believed that they were chosen by God to settle there, and the Africans were inferior both spiritually and developmentally, and so it was the Boers' right to subdue the Africans that were in the area. The Boers ended up killing or enslaving a lot of the Africans of that area. Boer cattlemen would create huge ranches and farms, and they also hunted for ivory
and used the proceeds to create a fairly well-developed colony in South Africa.